there are so many documentaries out there, and there's so many documentaries being made on so many different subjects, so it's actually, in some ways, from my perspective, hard to find those subjects. And so one of the challenges is when you're reading or whatever, you come across a subject, to sort of force yourself to think, is there a documentary in here? Even if you're not even, you know, you're not thinking about making films at all. And I do look to see if, certainly if someone has made a film that on this kind of subject before. I really also look to see if there's somehow a real emotional or psychological element to it. I mean, I always think that that enriches subject matter. And I also look for something that has this kind of controversial, or something that will, just in the subject matter, has an edge that I can work with, just to almost to bring the audience in, and even in the first act, that sort of sets up kind of, it sort of sets up the audience for you to take them in a lot of different directions. So I would, maybe that's what I would say.
Paul, do you want to?
Hi. I think, you know, I think I've realized actually after this last film that it's not so random. I used to think that I sort of chose subjects in sort of a random way, but I realized that there's a theme that I'm interested in, and that is what something looks like and the reality of it. So it's sort of it's the appearance versus the reality. And so that's usually sort of what draws me to something, that something on the outset feels a certain way and looks a certain way, but when you look beyond it, you see the complexity and the nuances. And I think the other thing for me is finding stories that tell us something about what it means to be a human being, and just how complicated that is, you know, just the idea of trying to explore what it is that we really are, and that's the stuff that I sort of gravitate towards. So.
That's that's actually a much bigger question than I was expecting for a start. Good for you. I don't think I've ever selected my work. I think it's always come to me, and I think it's always come to me through my own personal journey. I think filmmaking is a marvelous art form. I think it's a very important social tool for change, but I think it's secondary to how you live your life. I guess I come to this through having a very narcissistic father who was a very famous television personality. So my whole life people said, oh, must be so nice to have him for your dad. And it's never nice to have a parent who's a narcissist, because of course, it's funny now. So in truth, the most important thing in my life is the inner journey, which I sort of half learned from the Beatles, listening to their music as a kid. So I don't choose my work rationally, and I never have. I created Danger Bay because I watched television and thought, my daughter was 5, and I thought, how do you leave a kid alone in the room with all this shit on TV? You know, and I really did think to myself, well, I'd rather make health food than junk food, because I think it's a tremendous responsibility that we have in putting stuff into other people's psyches, because that's what we do, right? So that's kind of the answer for me.
Then I might add a more specific question then for you. At what point did you decide to make this film? This is obviously a story that you've been carrying for 40 years, and you've been making films for most of that time almost. So it's, at what point did you suddenly realize now's the time to tell this story? And why did you think that now was, this was important?
It's nice to name drop once in a while, don't you think? Just once in a while, okay. So I was sitting with Morgan Freeman the first day I met him by his swimming pool in rural Mississippi outside Charleston, which is a town of 2,100. And I was there because I had gotten a phone call out of the blue at my home in Oakville. I mean, this is a great kind of you know, the phone rings and I pick up the phone and a man says, "Is this Paul Saltzman?" "Yes." "Is this the Paul Saltzman who was jailed in Mississippi in 1965? And it's like, you know, you look at the phone. And it turned out to be a leading newspaper man in Mississippi. And that led to me going back just to see how things had changed. I hadn't made a film in 15 years. I was doing other things that were exciting and fun, you know, in a certain way. And I guess this plugs back into what I was just saying. In a certain way, I'd made a lot of films, I'd won awards, I'd made money, been there, done that. Life is much broader. So I stopped making films because of the broader. And I'm sitting with Morgan through a mutual friend because I was interested in one thing he had said on television that I happened to see a clip on YouTube. He said he felt safer living in Mississippi than anywhere else in America. And I thought, what's that about? So I was sitting with him and we were talking about life and color and race. And I was literally, I had this thought. I remember the moment I thought, what he's saying is really beautiful. Somebody should be filming this. It's like, oh, I guess I'm the only one here. So I started making a film which was really about Mississippi then and now. And then I realized, honest to God, if somebody told me it was on television, I would not watch it. And I'm an ex-civil rights worker. It's like boring. Do I really want to know how things have changed in Mississippi? No. What else is happening tonight? And so I thought, well, then we need a central character to make it more interesting. I guess that's me. And I'd never put myself in a film, and I almost didn't finish this film, because it brought up deep layers of exposing oneself. So I have a whole new respect for subjects in a documentary. I always have had respect, honestly, but now I have a whole new respect. So how did I decide to make this? It just happened, right? In that way.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Nisha, what made you decide to tell this story for The World Before Her, or these stories?
The world, but you know, it's interesting. It was actually in 1999. I was in India for on a research trip for one of my first films, and I was invited to an event, and it was a celebration. It was a party for a young woman named Yukta Mukhi, who had just won the Miss World pageant. She was an Indian woman who'd just won the Miss World pageant, and I was so stunned at how big the event was and what it meant, you know. It was almost like sort of the crowd, it was sort of like celebrating an athlete who had just won sort of an Olympic gold, you know. That was the sort of the sense of euphoria. And I started to realize that it was a very interesting window into looking at a country, you know, and how this country was changing, you know, the idea of beauty pageants. And also what it was saying about the changing role of women in India, you know, which is still sort of predominantly a patriarchal country. So I thought to myself, one of these days I'll revisit this story, and that's really what led me to it. And once I started to read about the pageants, and I started to read about the opposition to the pageants, then it became so much more interesting, because it became about the future of a country. And how that future was being written on the bodies of women, you know. So it was really about the relationship between nationalism and women. So.
Kirby, what was the genesis?
Well, it started just by my producer and I reading an article in Salon, and the statistics of rape, you know, the numbers are so incredible in the U.S. military that, I mean, at first we didn't believe them. But this was kind of a situation where, you know, once we did more research and found out they were even worse than the article said, but what was so shocking to me actually was not that actually no film had been made on this, and actually there hadn't even been a book that put the whole subject together. I mean, it was, even though this has been going on for a long, long time, it's really been covered up. It just has somehow been ignored, perhaps in part because in the U.S. there's such a divide between people who are involved with the military and people who aren't, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of crosstalk at all. But this to me was an example because of my side overlooking a story, because I'd followed Tailhook, the Tailhook scandal in the early 90s. I'd followed very closely the Air Force Academy, and I had never thought there's a film there. And then it was only, so it was, in some ways I was, I was just as shocked that I hadn't thought about making a film as that no one else had made a film. So this is kind of what I was saying before, is that I'm always trying to get into this mode of thinking, is there a film here? At the moment, when I'm not at all thinking about making films. It's a practice that I continually fail at, but but I try.
Now, in a film like yours, access is key. I mean, if you didn't have, the ability to speak to all the women and men that had been victims, I mean, you wouldn't have had a film. And for those of you that haven't seen the film yet, it opens with this incredible sequence where you see, just to dispel any doubt that this might be an isolated event or something, or just a few isolated stories. There's a barrage of all these women's testimony, and then it focuses on a select group for the rest of the film that you kind of ride with emotionally. And it's a powerful moment when you just see, you're like, oh my goodness, he interviewed this many women, and this many women had this consistent story. It's this pervasive. How did you manage to get so many people to speak to what would be obviously a very raw and painful subject matter?
Well, initially it was very difficult because not only had these women been raped, and they had oftentimes very extreme PTSD symptoms, they were very agoraphobic and very unlikely to talk, but also many of them had actually reported this and come forward, and when they did, the military, they'd experienced horrible reprisals, so they were very disinclined to speak at all. So it took a long process of outreach. I mean, I was reaching out for about a year in a very just in a very rigorous way, I would say. I mean, we reached out to therapists, to attorneys, to victims advocates, journalists. We used Facebook and the internet, continually searching for people. And it's one of the things I like to do is to really go broad. Look, if I come on a subject matter that I don't have a central subject, that the story's not being told around, the central subject could be any, in this case, of several 100,000. I like to reach out as much as possible and get as many subjects as possible. Not only because, obviously, the better the subject, the better the film, or the better the subjects, the better the film, but there's something about getting into a community and hearing stories again and again and again, and in this case, hearing the same stories again and again and again. That was what was so shocking. But that gives you, or gives me, a sense of the kind of the broader picture of the whole story.
I'm just curious, you never spoke to any of the accused. Was that by design from the outset, or was that just because it was too difficult to get any of them to talk?
We never tried. We thought about it. I mean, we had part of that research was in talking to the survivors that we were interviewing. We asked them if we could actually try to track down, their assailants, and in many cases we did. This is something, but we decided not to move forward with that. Partially because I was a little concerned. I mean, these are men who know how to kill, so I didn't want to endanger my subjects. But more importantly, what was so shocking about this whole thing was how pervasive it was, how systemic the problem was. And I didn't want to focus on 4 or 5 or 6 individuals. Like, I could have gone up to somebody's door and knocked on their door. It would have been, the audience is waiting for this scene. And I decided not to, because I wanted people not to focus on those individuals who'd raped the subjects of my film, but to focus on the people who could change it, which was the President, the Secretary of Defense, the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I actually think that was a very effective decision, because that otherwise the U.S. military could have deflected and said, well, they would either say that those are isolated incidents or something like. I mean, they'd come up with a whole wide range of sort of defenses. But when it's systemic, when they sort of critique a systemic, it's very hard for them to dodge that, and they haven't been. I mean, I was very surprised. They actually. The Secretary of Defense, Panetta, saw the film, and we know it made a major impact on him.
For those of you that don't know this, the Secretary of Defense ended up watching the film and holding a press conference a few days later announcing actual policy change in how such charges are addressed. So that's a pretty amazing feat for a documentary film to achieve. I think what we all aspire for is actually affecting some measurable real social change, and it doesn't get more measurable and real than that, so bravo. That's a logical segue to Paul. You're talking about approaching potentially adversarial subjects from talking about Kirby's experiences. You did that directly. You actually, you know, we're talking about, never mind somebody who could potentially hurt you. You went and talked to the man that did beat you up and assault you many years ago. What was that experience like to actually track down that man? And first of all, so many questions, like, how did you find him in the first place, and what was his response?
My manhood requires that I just say he didn't beat me up.
Okay.
He got in one punch, and I was faster than him and his 3 friends, thank God. And that's the first time I met him. I wanted to make sure that there were cameras, meaning I didn't want to meet him and say, well, we're going to film. I wanted to meet him with cameras rolling because it was important. It was as important to see his response in that first meeting as it was to see mine. And I didn't know what mine was going to be, right? And so one of the first things that's so interesting to me when I first meet him, and I meet him on the steps or at the steps of the LaFleur County Courthouse in Greenwood, Mississippi, which is where he basically got one punch into the side of my head, and it didn't hurt because your adrenaline kicks in and the fight or flight, what do you call that? The reptilian brain kicks in. And you know that those scenes with Schwarzenegger and the first time I saw it was in the first Terminator, where you see through his eyes and there's the grid and there's tracking like that. That's how it worked. There was no grid, but I went back the next day because I pressed charges, which the FBI came and said, "Are you out of your mind? You know, and if you're going to press charges, get out of town till the trial." But when I went back to show them all that stuff, I didn't even realize that there were trees on the lawn that I'd run right next to, or that there was a flagpole I'd run right beside. I didn't see any of that. So at any rate, I wanted to meet him in that same place. Excuse me. And there's so many subtleties. I mean, one of the things about film, I don't know if this happens with you, but you know, you see a film I've seen hundreds of times, meaning editing and editing and editing and editing. And then I see it on the screen. I'm looking forward to seeing it tomorrow night because one of the nice things about VIFF is that I've done 4 test screenings to get audience reactions, and they were at small film festivals, San Luis Obispo, Napa, Ashland, and with a selected audience in Toronto, friends, family, industry people, filmmakers. And when it premiered at the Toronto Festival, it was in something called the Doc Workshop. Well, that was professional. So actually the screening tomorrow night's the first real, nobody knows about this except what they've read, and they're not there for a reason. They're not there to give us feedback, and they're not there because it's industry. So I'm quite excited just to see how that plays. But there's so many subtleties that I still see in the film, and I'm assuming it's probably the same with each of you. In Prom Night in Mississippi, I've seen hundreds of times, and when I watch it now with an audience, I still, oh, look at that flicker in the eye right there, which of course is information. And there's a lot of information in movies. I suppose that's one of the reasons I love going to movies. There's so much there. So I'm taking too long here, and I'm not wanting to suck up your time. When you see the film, when I first meet him, watch the way he holds my elbow with his left hand. Very fascinating, because it's control. So I couldn't hit him, even if he wasn't thinking about it. He was controlling my right hand.
I was just going to add that, you know, whenever you see any film, whether it be a dramatic film or a documentary film, I'm always like fascinated by just performance, how humans behave, whether it's actors pretending to be another human or actual humans in the moment. And, you know, that moment where I notice him holding your elbow, but also just watching your face in that moment, because to be honest, I didn't know how you were going to react. And it's, you know, it's an amazing moment of screen performance. And I don't mean you're acting, just like of the energy of the moment. And yeah, I mean, I've been assaulted, and I don't know how it would be to confront my attacker and what I would do in that moment or how I'd respond. So your face has this just incredible map of emotion and thoughts. And as a viewer, you're there emotionally and mentally. You're like, oh my God, what would that be like? But to go back to the part of the original question, like, how did you pitch the idea to him to have that moment? Because for somebody like him,
I knew you'd help me with repeating the question. The newspaper man who phoned me is quite famous. Have any of you seen Ghosts of Mississippi, the Rob Reiner film? If you haven't, watch it. It's one of the more honest films about Mississippi. If any of you have seen Mississippi Burning, it's not an honest film. It's about how the FBI solved this case. They actually didn't solve it. One of the guys in my film, who wouldn't say it on camera, was one of the people who solved that case. And he wouldn't say it on camera because he said the children of the people who murdered Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner are still around. So that was fascinating for me as going back. So the guy, the newspaper man, would happen to be the guy who wouldn't let the case die against de Lebecquith's father. The guy who hit me, his father, was the guy who murdered Medgar Evers, as you said. His father was a leading KKK official, and he was one of the founders of the White Citizens Council in that area of Mississippi. And we civil rights workers at the time called the White Citizens Council the White Collar Klan. And so the way I found him was that I asked Jerry Mitchell, this newspaper man, have you ever been in touch with DeLay de Lebecquith, the son? The father had been convicted finally 31 years later, died in prison, and my conversations were post that. And he said, sure, I've got his phone number. I said, can I have it? He said, sure. He said, do you want me to phone him first and arrange that you'll call him or see that he doesn't mind? And I said, sure. So when I called up the guy who had punched me, the first thing he said, which I don't know to this day whether it was sincere, I don't think it was, but I don't know. First thing he said when I introduced myself is he said, I always wondered what happened to you. It didn't feel authentic in the moment, but maybe it was for him. And I became his new best friend. To him, I was his new best friend in the first instant. You know, I define friendship in a fairly profound way. When I look back sort of at life, I've never had more than 5 or 10 friends, many acquaintances, so for me so I'm his new best friend. He's not my friend, and that's not a judgment. Friendship is a process, and it's an evolution, and it's a depth and an intimacy. So he was delighted that I contacted him, and he was delighted that I wanted to film him, and he was delighted, I think, for a number of reasons. One, hatred is a lonely place, in truth. You know, the contracted heart that hates is, as one of the wisest people I've ever met said to me, he said, you know, emotion is a pipe, and if you close it against one emotion, you close it against all emotions. So the heart that hates is shut down, and so love doesn't get in there very well either. So he was delighted, and he was delighted because, and this is really true, I never ever judged him. That's just not who I am, or who I try to be, because it's not that I'm without judgment, you know.
Even if you didn't judge him, were you ever conflicted about the fact you were basically making this man well known in the process of making a film? Tomorrow night, hundreds of people are going to watch him on a big screen, and now people read his name in program notes and film festival guides.
It's so interesting you say that. I had a problem with TIFF. I'm not going to be very politically correct here. They didn't put me in the mainstream, this film, I shouldn't say me. They didn't put this film in the mainstream. They put it in the Doc Workshop, which was an honor, and it's an official selection. It was the world premiere. But I know the reasons. I found out the reasons, and they were the judgmentalness of the selectors. Somebody said, some people felt you weren't hard enough on them. I don't know if you've seen the Globe and Mail this morning. There's a rather nice piece on the film in the Globe this morning. And so the one of their concerns, I said I'd like to bring them up for a Q&A. I mean, whoa, wouldn't that be remarkable? Let the audience have their conversation with him like I had mine. Mine was spread over 5 years. But they said, no, they would not want to give him that spotlight. They did not want to honor his belief. You know, what's documentary film for if not to engage and let that engagement hopefully enlighten?
Thank you. Nisha, so on the topic of spending time with people who you might not see eye to eye with, you certainly did that in well, arguably in both camps, but especially in the fundamentalist camp, and you spend time with one young woman in particular, and there's a moment where, you know, I think the penny drops for the viewer, like, wow, what is she thinking? What was it like for you to be so embedded with, you know, both groups, but especially the kind of extremist camp and their weapons training and all that?
Are you talking about, when you say the penny drops, like what?
Well, just, I mean, you kind of, it's Prachi is her name,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You think, well, you know, maybe there's a certain kind of, you're trying to understand the logic of the thinking, and at a certain point you kind of realize these are extreme views. There's logic has been suspended, and that's what I mean by that, where the extremism of the training kind of hits you with a full force.
Yeah, yeah. It's really, I mean, it's really interesting. I agree with you, Paul, actually, in terms of documentary and the purpose of documentary, and I find that for myself as the older I get, the less I want to judge people, the more I want to understand them, and the more I feel it's important for them to express what it is that they think and feel, because I think that's the only way that we can actually make change. You know, is for people to sort of articulate their differences and where those differences come from. And I mean, you know, all of us are kind of shaped by things that are so much bigger than we are, you know, that are completely beyond our control. So you start to realize that, and you start to think, none of us are really free. None of us have any real kind of freedom. And so you've got to sort of look at things in that context, I think. But for me, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary when you spend time with somebody and in a world that is so different from you and what you hold dear and what you feel is right and moral and just. And it challenges you continually. It sort of challenges you, and you feel all sorts of things. I mean, there was so much anger and so much rage, and you know, I lived at the camp, the fundamentalist camp, while it was going on, and it was just 10 days. But in the middle of the camp, I just couldn't be there anymore. You know, I literally sort of thought, okay, I need a 5-star hotel. I got to get out of here. So we did. You know, we sort of midway through, we left because we couldn't stand being around these people. But when you spend enough time with them, you like them. You know, and that's what was always so difficult for me, was the fact that as human beings, I really liked them, and I respected some of their views, and I respected their integrity. Like, they had real integrity, and it was difficult to sort of make peace, I guess, you know, with the aspect that you liked, and then the hatred that they were teaching, and the stuff that they were spreading. So,
Do you think that's a necessary skill of a documentary filmmaker, is kind of having that ability to empathize and see? I mean, I find sometimes when I'm interviewing somebody, if you can get yourself emotionally to be with that person, like, you can, first of all, it's gonna uncork a whole wealth of information and emotion and realness that you wouldn't otherwise get. Did you have any moments where that was really difficult in this project?
yeah, constantly. You know, you're enraged all the time, but. I feel like, you know, when you're a documentary filmmaker, you're sort of two people in one, right? You're sort of the human being, you know, you're the person that's kind of reacting to things as a person, and then you're the messenger in some way, right? You're the person that's trying to get at a larger truth and larger ideas. So you're constantly sort of balancing those two, you know, and negotiating between those two identities. But I think you get kind of used to it, right? It doesn't feel sort of so psychotic. I think the first time I just felt, oh my God, this is so bizarre. But then eventually you get used to it, and you feel like that's your responsibility, you know?
Could I just quick? I mean, I think what Nietzsche said is so true. I mean, and for me, it was sort of coming at it from the other side, is that these women were so impressive and so powerful, and yet, I mean, they were breaking down every single interview, and I continually am asked the question. My producer did most of the interviews, and then I would come in at the end, but I'm right there, and I'm continually asked the question, wasn't it emotionally devastating? And yes, it was. But on the other hand, every time they break down and they go into this place of horror, I'm thinking, I can use that. I can use that to change things. And so it's this exactly that, I don't know if it's exactly schizophrenia, but it's that double thinking that goes on. It's quite unique, I guess, in some ways.
You mentioned something there that I'm curious about. You talked about your producer doing a lot of the interviews, and she's a woman. Was that because of the subject matter? It was more appropriate for a woman to be interviewing women about what was going on?
Yes, I mean that was the primary reason. I mean, she would be she would do the intake interviews over the phone, so she'd have established this relationship, and then she has 3 children, so she's very maternal. She's a very emotional person, so that was one reason. Also, it allowed me to kind of stay in this objective position. So, because we were always looking for, almost be more of a journalist. Like, now I need this fact, or I need to come in and I need them to say this exactly now that I've got this whole story out. Another thing is, on that note, is that I find that the first few times I made films, I was, the thing that was so most fascinating about making documentaries was the filmmaker-subject relationship, and I was completely immersed in it. And as I went farther on, I mean, I was producing those myself. I had a producer, I was working with a producer, and one of the things that was great about having a producer was they were then in between, because at some point it's like, oh no, not another subject. Right, and when I was earlier in my career, that was always great. I want to just get right in there. But the more I make films, the more I like to have that. Or in fact, I don't even know if I have the capacity. It sort of fills up after a while to hear people's stories one-on-one. Anyway, I mean, maybe it's just my own, I don't know, inadequacy or whatever, but it's a wonderful thing to have a producer. And although there's always this battle that goes on, because as a producer, I mean, I'm always saying the producer, it's your job, you have to go and talk to that person, and I don't, they're crazy, they might not be any good, I don't have the time for 2 hours, because when you're talking to survivors of sexual assault, it's always a story, and once you open that door, you're sitting on the phone with them for 2 hours, whether or not you know in the first 5 minutes that you can use that. And so it's this interesting kind of relationship that happens.
It's interesting you're talking about having a producer who can kind of enable you to have access that you, by virtue of your own identity, don't have, namely your gender. I'm curious, Nisha, like, was there parts of who you are that made you have access to these 2 different groups that you otherwise, that perhaps Kirby or Paul could not have made your film? And also, I'm curious, therefore, what was the experience of getting access to these 2 different worlds that you did?
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure, because I'm from India originally and a woman, and I speak Hindi, so that was, it really enabled me to kind of get into both camps, and I think the people sort of really, they were suspicious. I mean, especially within the fundamentalist world, they were very, very suspicious at first. But I kind of knew that the film that I wanted to make, because I wanted to really understand people, and what that means is that people have to understand you, and they have to trust you, and to sort of forge those sorts of relationships. You can't do it from Toronto. I couldn't do it from Canada. And so I started to base myself out of Bombay, and so I spent an awful lot of time in Bombay. And interestingly, I mean, it took, in order for us to get access to the fundamentalist camp, in order to film in that camp, it took 2 years, and it was really sort of me kind of, basically not taking no for an answer, but nicely, and sort of meeting people that were at various levels of the movement. And yeah, certainly sort of my gender and my color and race, it certainly helped.
And you ran into a problem at some point, right? Where you very nearly...
The first day of shooting, actually, the very first day. So it took 2 years to get access to this camp, and then the very first day of shooting, there was a person there who didn't know we were supposed to be there, and he tried to shut us down. It was unbelievable. It was really amazing, actually. And I just said, look, I'm not going. Like, I'm not leaving. So let's figure it out. But I'm not going. So we managed to convince them somehow. So.
Wow, well, I'm glad that you did, since the film's a remarkable achievement. Now, I'm curious about kind of switching gears, going into kind of more of a discussion of craft. Your film, The World Before Her, is exquisitely sculpted. I mean, when all of you finally see it, you'll see that these 2 different strands, these 2 different storylines that, otherwise, in objectively, they don't actually connect. But the way, when you're watching the film, they just naturally build, and you start seeing these parallels, and actually you start having feelings like, oh, this other side is actually starting to resemble the other one more. How did you approach that in the edit suite? Like, did you know the two main subjects from each side that you're going to follow right from the get-go, or did that come through editing? And where did you figure out the weave?
I mean, you know, such a complicated process. They all are, right? But this one was such a pain. Initially, the film was supposed to be very different from what it was. Initially, I was going to follow two girls in the two camps, going through a process of transformation, and literally, really, sort of, you know, our journey would be sort of through them, right? So we would watch them sort of change. But it became very, very difficult. And then eventually, what happens is the fundamentalists, every few years, they protest the pageant. So the idea was then we were going to film the fundamentalists protesting the pageant, and so the two storylines would converge. You know, that was the goal. Which, of course, I mean, whenever you start off with anything in terms of a documentary, it never happens, right? It never is what you expect it to be, what you want it to be. But I did know that because the worlds were so different ideologically, that all I had to do was to focus on that, and then sort of create kind of an argument, and create sort of a kind of a back and forth, a weave in the edit room. But it was very, very complicated. It was a very complicated edit, and I work with a brilliant, brilliant editor. Actually, his name is Dave Kazala. He's extraordinary. So we spent, I think, for us, you know, we spent the first 4 or 5 months simply looking at footage and talking and carding the film and sort of planning it out. You know, we really talked it through a lot, and my producers were freaking out. They were just completely like sweating and stuff. Like, what are you people doing, you know? But they gave us that space. They allowed us to kind of do what we needed to do, and the film really did sort of come together in the edit room. Yeah.
I'm curious how long, I always love asking how long documentary filmmakers actually edited their films for, because it varies so widely. Like, I remember, you know, I mean, Errol Morris edits his movies for like a year, and then on the flip side, you have Werner Herzog, who, you know, cut Grizzly Man in 9 days, or more to the point, Joe Beanie, his editor, cut it in 9 days, and you're like, what? How long were you actually editing The World Before?
It took about 9 months, yeah. Just enough time to give birth to a baby, right? So, yeah, that's what it was.
Wow. Paul, I'm curious, what was the editing process on The Last White Knight like? Like, I know there's a number of different interviews. Did you start editing the film with a number of interviews and decide to go back and see him again? How did that work?
Essentially, yes. I shot the film and finished shooting the film, I thought, in 2007. And on the last day of shooting, I found out about the separate proms in Charleston, where I was. And so, because I wanted to make that film, Prom Night in Mississippi, I had to focus on that, or I would have missed it happening. So I finished filming this film, and then the next 3 years I didn't touch it because of Prom Night just taking over. And as you know it, these things have energies of their own, and in a way it's like a runaway train, in a sense. That's over dramatic. It's, you know, it does have an energy and life of its own. So when I came back to this film, there had been a huge game changer. This black man was in the White House. And I had to go back, in my mind, I had to go back and ask DeLay de la Beckwith and Morgan Freeman and others. So there's this black guy in the White House. What did you feel the night he was elected? And so I started shooting again, and that brought DeLay to the forefront more, naturally, the energetic. And so then I filmed with him again and again. So I filmed with him 5 times. And the last time was just February of this year. So what started shooting in May of '07, finished shooting because of just what I'm saying. The editing process, when I thought, well, I'll put myself in the film, it was really to be a doorway, a window. If you're interested in this character's personal journey, meaning I got punched in the head and I took him to court, and that's drama, and it's cogent for the subject. So I actually filmed 17 pieces of interstitial material of Paul driving in the car, talking about what I would have asked you if you were Paul. And so the editing process was partly taking me out and out and out and out. And part of it was that was right for the film, and part of it was I was worried about being in it. And so I had everything transcribed, and I spent weeks, if not months, avoiding my transcripts. You know, and that's not fun. You know I should be editing my transcripts. My editor is getting paid, you know. And because I paid for the film out of my savings, which left me free to do anything I wanted. And I did that with Prom Night. Basically, I had $1 million in the bank, which was the result of all my years of film work, which was wonderful, and I was going to do a big renovation on my house. And my house is the same, and I made these 2 films. So, and you know, there's a positive and negative to that. You know, the old adage, of course, is never spend your own money. I guess I forgot that. But no, I didn't, you know, it was a very conscious thing. I didn't know what either film was going to be, and I didn't want any, you know, funder, producer, broadcaster, end user pressuring me, because I didn't want that, you know. So the editing process, I'm a good storyteller, but I'm not a great storyteller. And I'm a very good storyteller, but I'm not a great storyteller. But I know someone who's the best storyteller I've ever found. And his name is Tom Schlesinger, and he's a gift if any of you want to work with him. He's like staggering in the depth of his knowledge and the sensitivity of his being. So Tom, I had 80 hours when I finished shooting, which was not much, because on Prom Night I had 165 hours. I learned how wonderful video is until it came to the editing, because in the 15 years I didn't make films, we went from film to video. Oh, this is great, these little tapes are so cheap. So Prom Night was 10 months of editing with 3 editors full time, because we were trying to make Sundance. And this film was 1 editor, and it was about 7 months of editing, but in there was Paul's procrastination. So yeah, you know, it was, I didn't want to finish the film. At one point I thought, I'm digging my heels in here. What is this saying? And it literally was, I had to come to terms with my own fear of being that naked in front of an audience, myself. Because, you know, filmmakers, we are in our films, of course, but we're not in our films.
One of the interesting stylistic choices you make in the film is you use these kind of animated storyboards to kind of do reenactments of things that happened in the past. At what point, and when you see the film, there's some of these key moments, like the actual attack, and also, you know, a sequence where Harry Belafonte is describing what happens when they had gone back, and being at the airport in Jackson, Mississippi. And I mean, they're fantastic pieces, and they're really compelling. Where in the process did those come along? Was that an idea that you had at the beginning? Were you once going to do reenactments for those, or did that come through editing?
It was fairly simple, because I'd used that in Prom Night in Mississippi, and I'd used that in Prom Night because there were some things, as you saw, that I didn't have footage of, you know. And so when I thought in Prom Night, how do I deal with these? These are important pieces to tell. You know, there's a meeting of the parents who were putting on the white prom, and I tried to go talk to them, and they would never talk to me. I worked through their lawyer for 4 months, and they just didn't ever want to come on camera. And I knew from one of the girls, one of the key characters in Prom Night who had been at the meeting, that things were said, like, no nigger's going to rub up against my daughter. That's not how I brought her up, as an explanation of why they wanted a white prom. So that was an important scene, and there was no way to do it without using the voiceover storyteller of the young woman who was there. And my daughter had She was curating the literary festival at Illuminato for the last 5 years, and one of her panels was on graphic novels, and it was like, oh, that's the way to do it. Because then it's not trying to recreate, which I don't know how to do well, really. So when this film came along, in terms of the editing, there were these stories. Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier are chased by the Klan one night. Whoa, we got to see that. You know, and Medgar Evers is murdered by DeLay's father. How do I tell that? Well, we have to see it. And so the graphic novel just was such a good choice.
On the topic of using kind of visual storytelling motifs, Kirby, you use a lot of kind of found footage and archival footage, and I know sometimes you use stuff that you use under the fair use provision, and you've done that in a lot of your work. Is that something that's a creative motif you like to play with? Like, where does that come from?
Well, yes, no, absolutely. I mean, in the film I made, this film is not yet rated, which was about the U.S. film rating system. I used initially. I mean, it was obviously I needed to show clips of independent films that had been censored, or of studio films that hadn't been. And initially we budgeted, you know, like, well, maybe we could have 15 clips, and we did a budget, and it was like over $1 million, which was well over the budget of the film. So at that point, my attorney and I decided we could just try to fair use these things. And we were actually, since the film was about, in the U.S., it's the Motion Picture Association of America that oversees the U.S. film rating system, and that the MPAA is the trade organization and lobbying arm for the 6 major studios. So most of the clips I was actually using were from the studio. So I actually felt that if they tried to sue me for fair use, that would be the best thing that could happen in my film. I mean, I was once talking to an attorney who'd been an attorney actually was in this film, who'd been an attorney for Michael Moore, and it was interesting. He said, you know, that Michael Moore would always want to be sued because of the amount of the publicity that comes from that. So I felt I was kind of protected, and as a result, in the end, I was able to use, I don't know, like 130 clips, and it may completely change the film because of that. So and then I did it. Excuse me. I did it in my next film, Outrage, and I did it some in The Invisible War. I'm continually looking to fair use material. I mean, and things have changed, you know, over the last 5 years. So it's pretty much. I mean, as long as you follow certain guidelines, it's much more. You're much more able to fair use material than people actually had thought you were able to only 5 or 10 years ago.
And did they sue you?
No, they did, however, you know, illegally copy my film.
But did they say you'll never work in this town again?
You know, I've long ago realized I was never going to work in that town.
I think this is the perfect moment to open it up to questions in the audience. We're, I think, down to our less than final half hour. Is there any questions? I know people haven't seen the films necessarily yet. Yes, and if you can just wait for the microphone to come down to you.
This is sort of a nibbly question, but given your topic, do you get releases from everybody that you interview? And at what point, how, you know, widespread is the release? I mean, does it go into video, DVD, all that kind of stuff? And at what point in the process do you get them to sign it?
You guys are on the spot. Are there any E&O lawyers in the audience, specifically from these guys' films? I don't know who wants to answer that.
I mean, normally you get a release form from somebody fairly quickly. You know, like sort of if you're interviewing your subjects, you get them to sign. I tend to wait because especially in India, you know, people are very, very suspicious of signing their name to things. So I tend to wait until they trust me, and then but I always tell them that I'm going to have to get them to sign something, and it's standard, and then they do, and often you do get resistance. For sure, I got resistance from the Times people, from the people who run the beauty pageant. They had actually instructed the girls not to sign anything. So that was a real pain. But eventually it worked out. But that was definitely problematic. So yeah.
The only times I didn't get people to sign up front, and I would never film anybody ever again without them signing first. The only two times I didn't do that, once because the person wouldn't give me a release, and the other time because I forgot, became difficult. So what I do, which is not a lie, is I say I can't film without your permission to film. And most people like being filmed. I also say I can't film without your permission to film and to use it. I say to use it softer. And the two times are interesting. The daughter of the main couple that organized the white prom was on the committee to organize the first integrated prom. The people, the administration wanted the committee that was going to organize the first integrated prom in the history of the town to have both sides on it. They wanted to have one of the main white parents on it who was part of the school system, and the daughter of the other main couple. And the daughter of the other main couple, when it came time to sign, you know, we were sitting around a big conference table with 20 people, and the release forms were passed to everyone to sign before we started shooting, and she wouldn't sign hers. So I, you know, well, okay, we're going to continue shooting. And she never did sign hers. And the second time was one of the great characters in The Last White Knight is a retired Jewish contractor named Joe Harris. And when I said that the real truth of the story, Mississippi Burning, was not the FBI, it actually was Joe Harris and his business partner. I don't know if you remember, if anyone remembers that period, depending on how old you are. They couldn't find Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner's bodies for 64 days, I think it was. And they couldn't find them because they were buried in an earthen dam on a farm. And the governor of Mississippi at the time, I remember this, the reason I went to Mississippi to do civil rights work was I was just so aghast and devastated in a human sense, watching television in Toronto the summer before when these kids had disappeared, and they were searching for their bodies. I remember the governor of Mississippi going on television saying, quote, "Oh, those boys are probably up there in New York making fun of us Southerners," and he knew they were dead and buried because the governor and his secret police, called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, and they really were a secret police, were part of the execution. They were part of the murder. Now, a little bit of that's come out, not all of it, because you still have a very strong Southern old boys system in place. The power and the money still resides mostly in those kinds of hands. So Joe Harris, I didn't get a release form first. And during the interview, he kind of lost it at one moment. I mean, he gave me wonderful material. I mean, one of the best scenes in the film, because it's so honest and real, is he says to me, you came down here with our Jewish names, you civil rights workers, you freedom riders, and people were saying the goddamn Jews are down in Mississippi tearing the place apart. We told you not to come. We told you to stay away, but no, you wouldn't. And that was great. I didn't know that. I didn't know that about the Jewish community, and I'm Jewish. I didn't know that. But he lost it a little bit in a certain way by saying, Obama's a Muslim, and then he went on. So when I came to ask for a release form afterwards, he said no. And his son's a lawyer. And his son tried to help us get a release form. The son was in agreement with giving a release form, and he wouldn't. So I had, in 2 films, I had 2 people who didn't sign their release form. We got, because the fair usage laws that Kirby was talking about are more advanced than they are in Canada, we therefore got our E&O insurance through New York. And it cost on prom night $18,000 for our lawyer, which was way over budget, to get the clearances. But it turns out, thank God, that Mississippi is one of 4 states in the Union that does not have the same privacy protection as all the other states does. And there's a provision in there that if you're talking about a public subject and you know you are being filmed, you have no right to privacy. So, but I would never, you know, yeah, you get them signed up front, because why be there?
I have to ask then, Paul, I mean, there's a scene in the film where there's these 3 hooded clans members. They signed releases?
Oh yeah, before we filmed them.
Wow.
It took 6 months, not 2 years. I can understand your 2 years about the fundamentalists. It took 6 months to get them to agree. But yes, they were signed beforehand.
And I know slightly off topic of the question. I'm just curious, how did you convince those 3 hooded clan members to participate? Did they care what the film was about?
I gave it thought beforehand. I knew that they could just go on the line and find out that Paul Saltzman was a nigger lover in that terminology. And that is still terminology that's used in some quarters today. So I knew that there was no point trying to pretend. So from the beginning I said I was down here in the 60s. I didn't say I was a civil rights worker on the other side. If they wanted, I said I was down here in the 60s. And I've come back to make a film about, and I would like you to be in it. And in general, what I've said to people, including the kids that are so candid on camera in prom night, is I say to people, if it's warranted, and it was true with the Klans people, I said, I don't really care what you say. I use these words. I said, I don't really care what you say. I care that you tell me what your real feelings are, and I can only guarantee you one thing, and that is that when I'm editing, I won't edit to manipulate. I'll edit to keep the essence of what you're saying, because that's why I'm here, to hear the essence of what you feel and what you believe.
Yeah, that's a good line. I'm going to use that one. It's quite good. It's good.
The royalties are really
Well, write that line down and try to get sued. Those are the lessons from today.
Right. Just briefly, yes, try. Yeah, I absolutely try to get a release. There are sometimes when, a few cases when I don't, and then I still shoot, because sometimes when people don't sign a release, they actually feel freer, and then it's a little bit of a gamble, but sometimes you even get better material. Obviously, my first choice, though, is signed a release.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I want to say something. Sorry. That was grabby. Who was that?
You only have 5 friends. No, sorry.
Maybe that's why. This is very important. My New York lawyer, who's fabulous, and her expertise is fair usage law, and her devotion is documentary, though she does more than that. She said, it doesn't matter if you get a release form, if on the beginning of your shooting, on camera, you say, thank you very much for giving me the interview. You know that I'll be doing it for this film and for this purpose, and is that fine? And if they say yes, you don't need a signature. It's better to have the signature, because the piece of paper defines things more clearly than what I just said.
I've heard that before.
Let me just add to that. I think that's probably true, unless you have a litigious subject. And then an E&O attorney, then it could get tricky. I mean, I think you're 100% right. Sometimes, in many ways, you don't even need a release if somebody's aware that they're being filmed and they're not going into very personal subject matter, I think. But I always worry about E&O.
I've found that that goes back to actually kind of that assessment of how high profile they are. If they're a public figure, then you can get away with that. I know on EcoPirate, there's a couple of interviews where we had a high profile figure and they gave us an interview and then suddenly they ran off. And when it came time to show our lawyer, they said, well, look, they're a public figure. They know what this is about. They couldn't have do that. There's no reasonable claim that can be made that they had no idea this was going to be used. So, whereas if you're just talking to a lay person, a civilian who's never been interviewed before, they might be able to make a case. So that seems to be.
The senator who's an attorney.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was a question over here, Peg Campbell.
I just would like to ask you about the saying about kill your little darlings, in the editing room when you have to let go of footage and material that you really want to use, but it doesn't completely fit. And so I'd like to hear from each of you about if there were any of those moments in the editing process of things that you wanted to use, couldn't make it work, and just what were they and how did you deal with letting go?
Yeah, I think there are still moments, that I think, oh God, I wish we didn't lose that. You know, I'm always filled with regret. Actually, it's a really painful, for me. It's a really painful. It's a very painful process. But I think that's why you have an editor. That's why you have an editor who's able to explain or challenge you. You know, in terms of, because you can't have everything in the film. It just sort of weighs it down, and it actually overall it kind of makes the film suffer. But it's I find it really, really tough to give stuff up. Yeah.
Here's what I'm trying to say. Tom Schlesinger, my exquisite story consultant, who's actually helped people win Academy Awards dramatic features by fixing scripts, which is a pretty good recommendation. I cut the 80 hours down to 4 hours, and then I screened those 4 hours with Tom and with my co-producer, Patricia Aquino. And when the screening was over, Tom said, "That's not the film you're making." And I said, "What do you mean?" Like this, you know, months and months. What do you mean? Aren't we going to finish in 9 more days? I don't know how anyone edits a film in 9 days. It takes that long just to go to the bathroom and come back to the editing machine. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "This film is not about you returning to Mississippi." And I said, "What's it about?" So I was at least open enough. He said, "This is about 2 men in a room. This is about 2 men in a room who could have destroyed each other's lives." And I hadn't really thought about it that way. And who meet again and talk. So the answer about whether you keep your babies in and not is that one of the things I learned from Tom, which is, you'd think you'd know it just because you're a filmmaker, but not until someone says it in language. You know, in the beginning there was the word type of thing. You know, you have to follow the through line of your film. I've seen so many films, $100 million, $200 million studio films or $29 documentaries, where the storytelling departs from the through line, and then you get bored, and you get fidgety, or you're confused, I am. And it doesn't mean you can't go away from the through line, but you go away from the through line because it leads you away, and you come back to it because it leads you back to the through line, and that's what carries you through the film, and it's basically dramatic structure. I have a friend who's produced and written and directed major Hollywood films, and he's a wonderful writer and a wonderful human being. And one day Spielberg asked him to come to Amblin to talk to some of his writers about writing movies. And this is my friend who's being asked and who tells me the story. So he walks into a conference room, and there's 10 Spielberg writers sitting around the table. And the first thing my friend said is, he said, "The key to great storytelling is to follow the internal journey of your lead character, and all the outer action will fall into place." Do you know what they said to him? They said to him, "How come no one's ever told us that?" So, you know, you follow that, and therefore your babies all go into the DVD extras.
No, it's a real you know, slaughterhouse in my working process. But I sort of have a method, because I mean, one of the things about making documentaries is not only do you have knowledge of all this additional material that an audience isn't seeing, but you have an extensive relationship with these subjects that is informing how you cut, and sort of in some ways misdirecting you how you cut. So what I do is, once I have a film that's coherent, like a second or third rough cut, something like that, I actually just invite friends or friends of friends over to my house, and they can be anybody. It doesn't matter. It could be somebody's mother, somebody's 60-year-old daughter. I really don't care. They can be in the film business or not. And about 15 people, and I show the film, and then afterwards I ask them to comment on it. They can comment on anything they want, the smallest detail to the largest thematic element of the film. And then the conversation starts, and the people will inevitably, because it's a work in progress, people are always giving you advice, or will inevitably turn to you and say, well, why don't you do it this way, or why did you do it this way? And at that moment, I deflect it, and I say, does anybody else feel the same way this person does? And what happens is the conversation starts developing about the film in front of you, and you suddenly have this entirely different perspective on the film. And also, you kind of have a poll. If you have 10 people and 9 people absolutely feel that this character is repulsive, then, and you love this character, well, maybe you still keep the character in, but you're aware that the character's reading is repulsive. And I just, it goes on for about an hour and a half. And I do this about every couple of weeks in the editing process, 10, 11, 12 times sometimes. And it really, it's actually a very efficient way to move through the editing process, is because oftentimes you have the film in a shape that you like, but when audiences come in and start giving you feedback, you immediately realize, no, you don't. And so it actually speeds up the editing process and addresses that issue.
I think we have time for one last question.
Kirby, hi. I'm a filmmaker, and I'm working through fictional and nonfiction on military subjects. And I'm just wondering, because I know how closed the military is, and how the impact of your results are going to impact other military, like the RCMP here is undergoing a lot of cases. What do you think is going to happen in the future?
I don't know. I mean, we were able to get into the Pentagon. When I was there and interview several two-star generals and people very high up in this whole issue of sexual assault. And when I was there, I think our minder, who was really very nice, said, I think you're the second independent documentary filmmaker that's been in the last 10 years. And I thought to myself, why the hell did you let me in? So the interviews were, from our perspective, quite good, but from their perspective, not so good. However, the film itself has been surprisingly well received. The military is buying, several branches are buying DVDs to use as in sexual assault training, because the tools they had were so poor. So, in the film, I mean, we were very, very careful not to take an anti-military position. I mean, I think even though the film is kind of a stinging critique, people who are in the military don't feel like it's attacking the military or that it's attacking men per se. And so I don't know. I actually think, with Secretary Panetta, who I think is a very open-minded Secretary of Defense, I think there's a possibility for people seeing this as an opportunity. There's, sometimes it's very hard to change an institution even from the top. And so I think there are people I know there are people within the military who see this film as a tool to change that. And so they could look at other filmmakers the same way. But the key for us was to not make it anti-military, because they just completely circle the wagons when that happens.
I think that's all the time we have for today. So I just want to wrap things up by saying, I think when we talk about the grand tradition of documentary cinema being a powerful tool to engage society in complex and highly sensitive ideas, and also be a form of cultural diplomacy, you can't come up with 3 better examples than the films made by the 3 people next to me today. So I want to thank Kirby Dick, Paul Saltzman, and Nisha Pahuja, and I hope you all get to see their films. You can look in the program guide to see when they're on, but the films are, just to recap, The Invisible War, The Last White Knight, and The World Before Her. So thank you all for coming today, and I hope you'll...
I just want to add, thank you to you, but it shows you that always start your title of your film with the.
Thank you. And thank you to Rogers for presenting this.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It was an awesome panel. You did a great job moderating. If you have questions for our filmmakers, I ask that you please ask them out in the lobby so that we can set up for our next session. Thank you so much, and see you soon.